you're live. So, about the item and arrangement approach. So, first point is the word. So, what's item and arrangement model? So, item and arrangement model, item and process model, and item and paradigm model. Right? IA, item and arrangement, IP, item and process, and IPA, item and paradigm model are different approaches to morphological analysis in linguistics. 1. Item and arrangement model. This approach views words as built up by arranging discrete, this is item and arrangement, built up by arranging discrete morphemes in a linear sequence. So, morphemes in a linear sequence. In this model, each morpheme or item has a specific meaning or grammatical function. So each morpheme or item has a specific meaning, is linear, uh, has a specific meaning or grammatical function, and they are arranged in a specific order. For example, the word dogs would be analyzed as consisting of the morphemes dog, the base, and s, the plural marker. The focus is on the structure and order of these morphemes. Second, item and process model, IP model. This model differs in that it emphasizes the processes that modify a base form rather than focusing on morphemes as separate entities. So it modifies the base form rather than focusing on the morphemes as separate entities. So it tries to modify the base form. Morphological processes like affixation, reduplication, and internal changes, such as vowel shift in sing to sang, are key here. The model views morphological changes as transformations applied to a root or base form. So that's the item and process model. In item and arrangement, we'll look at morphemes and their sequence. Each morpheme has a meaning. Now, the item and paradigm model. Item and paradigm model, IPA model. This model, morphemes here are organized into paradigms where words form is understood in relation to other words in a morphological paradigm, such as different forms of a verb or noun. The focus is on the system of forms. So the focus in the item and paradigm model is on. Morphemes are organized into paradigms. A word's form is understood in relation to other words in a morphological paradigm, such as different forms of a verb or noun. The focus is on the system of forms, for example, different verb conjugations or noun declensions, rather than the individual morphemes or processes. Each of these models provides a different perspective on how words are formed and how their structure can be analyzed, and they are used to address different linguistic phenomena. Now, explanation for why the third statement is incorrect uh, is is accurate. So talking about the question now. So from the item and arrangement point of view, first, the word like dogs is viewed as a set of morphemes which include a root with its corresponding exponental morph, and root with its exponental morph, and plural morpheme with its corresponding morph. The second, that each piece of morphosyntactic information is paired with some morph or exponent. Each piece of morphosyntactic information is paired with some morph or exponent. That is also very true in the item and arrangement model, since item and arrangement looks at each morpheme being a separate entity which has a meaning or grammatical function. Now the second, after this, the third, the word like cats is viewed as a root that applies to a root, paired with a set of morphosyntactic features. So cats is viewed as a rule which applies to root. So it's not the change of the root, as in I think item and process model. It is rather item and process talks about change of the root, whereas item and arrangement talks about different morphemes coming together. The word cats is viewed as a rule which applies to a root paired with a set of morphosyntactic features. This does not align with the definition of the item and arrangement model. This rather aligns with the definition of the item and process model, but not item and arrangement model. Now, the next option, the resulting phonological sequence of a combination of morphs is treated as a single piece and not as a composite of morphs. That is not true, not at all true. It is indeed a composite of morphs, a combination of morphs, not not a single piece, not a single piece. That that uh, so this statement also does not align with the definition of the item and arrangement process. Now, your explanation for why the third statement is incorrect is accurate. The item and arrangement model. In the item and arrangement model, words are analyzed as sequences of discrete morphemes arranged in a specific order. Each morpheme has a distinct role and meaning. The third statement describes a word like cats as a root combined with a set of morphosyntactic features, which aligns more with the item and process model. Right? In this model, the focus is on the processes that apply to the root rather than on the arrangement of discrete morphemes. So focus is on the processes which apply to the root rather than on the arrangement of discrete morphemes. Yes, in this model, the item and process model. Now, in contrast, the item and arrangement model looks at the word as a sequence of morphemes. So, item and arrangement model looks at the word as a sequence of morphemes, such as cat. So, item and arrangement model looks at the word as a sequence of morphemes. The item and arrangement model looks at the word as a sequence of morphemes, such as cat and the plural s in cats, and how they are combined in a linear sequence. This approach emphasizes the arrangement of these morphemes rather than the application of morphological features or rules. So, this approach emphasizes the arrangement of these morphemes rather than the application of the morphological rules or features. Now, probably the fourth, yes, you're right about the fourth statement in the item and arrangement model. It's not accurate to say that the resulting phonological sequence is treated as a single piece rather than a composite of morphs. It is not accurate to say that the resulting phonological sequence is treated as a single piece rather than a composite of morphs in the item and arrangement model. The item and arrangement model focuses on morphemes being arranged sequentially, so each morpheme is treated individually. Regarding the copy theory and case theory, your explanation is correct. Copy theory, which is associated with the movement and traces left behind by moved constituents, does not replace the case theory. Does not replace the case theory. Case theory deals with grammatical relations and roles of constituents within sentences. So the next question is, so which of the following is not correct? First, copy theory replaces the case theory. It's not correct. Copy theory of movement is endorsed by the minimalist program. True. When a constituent moves, it leaves a copy of itself. That is also true. A chain consists of multiple copies of moved constituent. That is also very true. Now, as per these statements about the copy theory, when a constituent moves, it does indeed leave a copy of itself. That this is a core idea of the copy theory. Next, a chain does consist of multiple copies of the moved constituent, reflecting the traces left behind. Third, the minimalist program developed by Noam Chomsky does endorse the copy theory of movement. So all of these statements you mentioned above about the copy theory are accurate in the context of the minimalist program. Now, yes, the use of dummy auxiliary do. So, the use of dummy do in English, which takes place only when other options for realizing tense and agreement are blocked, can be referred to as an example of greed, of last resort. I'm so sorry, of last resort. The use of dummy do in English, which takes place only when other options of realizing tense and agreement are blocked, can be referred to as an example of the last resort. Let's look at the explanation. The use of dummy auxiliary do in English is indeed referred to as a last resort. This occurs when other options for realizing tense and agreement are unavailable or blocked. The dummy do is used to satisfy grammatical requirements when no other forms are applicable. Now, in linguistic theory, particularly within the framework of the minimalist program, these terms have specific meanings. So, the explanation for greed spell out procrastinate and last resort. So, greed, this refers to a principle where movement occurs only if it benefits the moved element in some way. Essentially, it means that an element will move to satisfy its own needs or requirements, such as checking its features or fulfilling its role in the structure. Second spell out. This is the process by which syntactic structures are translated into their phonological forms. At a certain point in the derivation, syntactic structures are spelled out to the phonological component, the which then assigns the final pronunciation of the sentence. Third, procrastinate. In this context, procrastination refers to delaying movement until absolutely necessary. It means that movement of an element is postponed until no other options are available, often because it involves avoiding unnecessary movement or keeping element in place until their final positioning is required. These concepts help explain different aspects of syntactic theory and the rules governing sentence structure and movement in language. हाँ? एक घंटे बाद Now, in the minimalist program, greed is a principle that dictates that movement of an element occurs only if it benefits the moved element by satisfying its specific requirements. Essentially, it means that an element will move to achieve its own goals or needs within the syntactic structure. This principle ensures that the movement is not arbitrary but motivated by a need to check or fulfill the requirements of the element moving. In relation to the given statement, the economy constraint allowing movement only if it satisfies the requirements of the moved element aligns directly with the concept of greed. It highlights that movement happens only when necessary to meet the needs or features of the moving element, thereby minimizing unnecessary movement and ensuring efficiency in the syntactic derivation. Now, spell out. This is the process where syntactic structures are translated into their phonological forms. It involves the final stage of syntax, where the structure is given its phonological representation. For example, in the sentence, she has eaten, the syntax has to be spelled out into its phonological form. The structure for has eaten gets translated into how we actually pronounce it in spoken language. Second, procrastinate. This refers to delaying movement until it becomes absolutely necessary. It means that an element will avoid moving until no other option is available. Example, in what did she say? The verb did is inserted as a dummy auxiliary. The structure delays moving say. The structure delays moving say, the word say, until did is used because it's necessary to form the question. What did she say? So the structure delays moving say until did is used because it's necessary to form the question. Now, the third, last resort. This term describes using an option only when all other alternatives are unavailable. So, last resort is an option used when all other alternatives are unavailable. It's applied in scenarios where a specific solution is used as a final option. It is applied in scenarios where a specific solution is used as a final option. For example, the use of the dummy auxiliary do in the sentences like, I do like chocolate, occurs only when no other means for realizing tense or agreement are available. It's a last resort to ensure grammaticality. So that's the last resort. Then we have greed. As mentioned, this involves movement only if it satisfies the requirements of the moving element. Only if it satisfies the requirements of the moving element. So in example, in whom did you see? Whom did you see? The movement of whom to the front of the sentence satisfies its needs to check its case features. So, in the later government and binding theory, which came out about in around 1981, they changed the term. What used to be called as an inflectional phrase, they started calling it tense phrase. It's just a shift in terminology to better fit their evolving theories on syntax. Inflectional phrase and tense phrase, basically, they are the same thing, just different names. I guess they thought it sounded better or fit their ideas better. So configurational languages, the dummy do is done, everything is done. Now the next question, in the minimalist program, a general economic constraint allowing the movement of an element only if it satisfies the requirements of the moved element is greed, of course. The next question, in later government and binding theory, the term tense phrase is used for what was earlier called the inflectional phrase, right? So before the government and binding theory, uh, what was inflectional phrase became tense phrase after the government and binding theory. Now, the next, in configurational languages, grammatical relationships within constructions are expressed mainly by, so in the configurational languages, the grammatical relationships within the constructions, they are expressed mainly by the word order. Now, the in the configurational languages, there are languages where the way words are put together in a sentence, like the order of words, is super important for understanding the meaning. It's not just about the words themselves, but how their positions affect their roles in the sentence. So, when we say the grammatical relationships in these languages are expressed mainly by word order, it means that changing the order of the words can change the meaning of the sentence. For example, in English, the cat chased the dog has a different meaning than the dog chased the cat just because of the word order. Now, moving on to the next question. So, prosodies are features in prosodic phonology which extend over stretches of utterance. So, prosodies in prosodic phonology involve features like pitch, rhythm, and intonation that extend over larger stretches of speech, not just individual sounds or words. They play a role in conveying meaning, emotion, and emphasis across phrases or sentences. For example, pitch can change to show whether a sentence is a question or a statement. Now, to understand prosodic features, linguists use tools like pitch contours, which track how pitch changes over time. So, to understand prosodic features, linguists use tools like pitch contours, which track how pitch changes over time. So, pitch contours track how pitch changes over time. And stress patterns, so they use pitch contours to track pitch, and it's changing over time, and uh, also the stress patterns to analyze the rhythm and emphasis of speech. So stress patterns can tell you about the rhythm and emphasis on words in the speech. Now these features help us to interpret nuances like sarcasm or questioning and are crucial for natural sounding speech. Now, moving on to the next question is about autosegmental phonology. So, a floating tone in autosegmental phonology is one which can never be detached from a syllable, or is one which docks with a consonant after the application of the phonological rule, or is one which constantly attached to a syllable, or is one which has been separated from a syllable following the application of the phonological rule. So, floating tone in the autosegmental phonology is certainly the one which has been separated from a syllable following the application of a phonological rule. So, after the application of a phonological rule um, on a syllable, something separates from that syllable on which the phonological rule was applied, and that separated part is termed as the floating tone. So, autosegmental phonology introduced by John Goldsmith in 1976. 1976 is a framework that deals with the way tones and other features can be organized across different segments of speech. It looks at how tonal patterns, for instance, can be represented separately from the segments of a syllable, like consonants and vowels. In autosegmental phonology, tones are treated as separate tiers. Tones are treated as separate tiers from segmental tier. So tones have a separate tier, and there's a segmental tier, and there's a tonal tier. So this is the tonal tier, and this is the segmental tier. Segmental tier, tonal tier, right? Um, Now, this means that tones can float or exist independently of the segments they are associated with until they dock or attach to a specific part of the syllable. Now, a floating tone specifically is a tone that has been separated from its original syllable due to the application of a phonological rule. For example, in some languages, tones may shift or move from one syllable to another due to phonological processes. In some languages, tones may shift or move from one syllable to another due to phonological processes. Perfectly possible. Now, this floating tone will eventually attach to a new syllable, demonstrating how tonal patterns can change across different segments of speech. Now, autosegmental phonology helps analyze complex tonal systems and other non segmental features by showing how these features can be organized independently but interact with segmental structures in language. Now, this theory has been particularly useful in studying languages with complex tone systems like many African and Asian languages. Now, let's take a look at a real life example from the Bantu language, specifically Swahili, which has a complex tonal system. In Swahili, the tone of a word can affect its meaning. For instance, the word mwana can mean child. Mwana, as you can see, mwana over here. It means child with different tone patterns, could mean offspring or descendant. Offspring, as in, yeah, it's offspring, child, descendant. These all pertain to the same person. Like I am the child of my parents, but I'm also the offspring of my parents, and also the descendant of my parents. Like, for example, in my language we would say it like something like, um, descendant, उन्हीं से आया नहीं, उन्हीं से आया नहीं, or yeah, so उन्हीं से आया नहीं versus उनका लड़का आई are two different things, but this can be expressed with the same word, just by changing the tone of the word mwana in Swahili. Right. Now, here's how autosegmental phonology works with this. First, separate tiers. In autosegmental phonology, tones are represented on a separate tier from the segmental phonemes like consonants and vowels. For example, if we consider the word moana with a high tone on the first syllable and a low tone on the second syllable, like moana, 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 the tone pattern is represented on a different tier from the segmental structure of the word. Now, floating tones. Sometimes a tone may be separated from its original segment. So sometimes a tone may be separated from its original segment due to a phonological rule, right? For example, in a process called tone shift, the high tone from the first syllable might float to a different part of the word. So, if the tone rule dictates that high tones should be spread across the entire word, the high tone may float over to the second syllable, changing how the word is pronounced and understood. Next is docking. After the phonological rule has applied, the floating tone will dock or attach to the syllable according to the rules of the language. This docking can affect the meaning of the word significantly. Autosegmental phonology provides a way to visually and analytically separate the tones from the segments, allowing the linguists to understand how tones interact with the segmental structure of a language and how they can be altered and reorganized due to phonological rules. Now imagine Swahili words have different layers for their tones and sounds. Layers, tones are on one layer and actual sounds like consonants and vowels are on another layer. Second, floating tones. Floating tones, sometimes a tone can float away from its usual spot because of certain rules in the language. Third, docking. After the floating tone moves around, it lands on a different part of the word, which can change the word's meaning. So, autosegmental phonology helps us understand how tones can move around and change how words are pronounced and understood. Now, autosegmental phonology was groundbreaking for its time because it introduced the idea that phonological features could exist on separate tiers or layers. However, it started to seem limited because it did not fully explain why some phonological patterns occur and others don't. Optimality theory, on the other hand, offered a more comprehensive approach. It proposed that all languages have the same basic constraints on their sound patterns, but different languages prioritize these constraints differently. This made it possible to explain a wider range of phonological phenomena and account for why languages can have different sound patterns. So while autosegmental phonology was a significant step forward, optimality theory provided a more flexible and universal framework for understanding phonology. Now, a simpler explanation. Autosegmental phonology was an important development, but it had limitations. It focused on how sounds are organized in separate layers, but did not fully explain why different languages have different sound patterns. Optimality theory, however, introduced the idea that all languages have the same basic rules but use them differently. This approach helps explain a broader range of sound patterns across languages, making it a more flexible and comprehensive theory compared to the autosegmental phonology. Now, how does the optimality theory work? Optimality theory works by suggesting that all languages have the same set of basic constraints on how sounds can be organized. However, different languages prioritize these constraints differently. In essence, languages generate multiple possible sound patterns, that is, candidates for any given input. These candidates are then evaluated against a set of ranked constraints. The most optimal or best candidate, which satisfies the highest ranked constraints, the most is selected as the actual output. So it's like having a set of rules it's like having a set of rules that every language follows, but how strictly each rule is applied varies between languages. Now, exemplification of the working of the optimality theory with a real world example. Sure. Let's use the example of how different languages handle the pronunciation of the word input. Imagine the input is input and we want to simplify it for pronunciation. Here are some possible candidates: input, input, input. In English, the constraints prioritize maintaining the integrity of the original input, that is faithfulness, and avoiding complex clusters of consonants, that is markedness. In contrast, in another language, constraints might prioritize simpler, more fluid pronunciations over preserving the original form. So this language might prefer input or impit based on how the language ranks constraints like the preservation of the original form and avoiding complex sounds. It will choose the most optimal candidate. English, for instance, ranks preserving the original form higher, so input stays as it is. Cool. So now we will be talking about, let's see if I can get connected to the internet. I don't think so, but all right, now let's move on to the discussion of the next question. Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. What's the next question?
Well, the next question is again about the autosegmental phonology. Now, in autosegmental phonology, obligatory contour principle prohibits first, two nasal consonants from being adjacent. Second, two identical tones from being adjacent. Third, two identical vowels from being adjacent. Fourth, two identical oral consonants from being adjacent. So the autosegmental phonology here, the obligatory contour principle prohibits two identical tones from being adjacent. Now, I want you to explain what obligatory contour principle does, like exemplify with a real world example what it does, and yes, also explain how this statement relates with autosegmental phonology and how does it make a contribution to the autosegmental phonology.
The obligatory contour principle, OCP, in autosegmental phonology is a rule that prohibits adjacent identical elements within a specific tier. In languages where tones are used to distinguish words, The OCP would prevent two identical tones from appearing next to each other. Take Mandarin Chinese as an example. Mandarin has a tonal system where the tone of a syllable can change the meaning of the word. Suppose there's a rule in Mandarin that disallows two identical tones in a row within a word. If a word were to have two adjacent identical tones, like high tones, the OCP would prohibit this, ensuring that the tones are varied or that the word structure is adjusted to avoid this repetition. This principle is important in autosegmental phonology because it helps explain why certain sound patterns occur and why others do not. It shows how phonological rules can influence the structure of words to avoid redundant or conflicting elements, maintaining harmony within the phonological system of a language.
It's got disconnected. Now the next question. So an approach in phonology where an input representation is associated with a large class of the candidate output representations, and various kinds of filters are used to evaluate their outputs and select the one which is most well formed. So an approach in phonology.
That approach is known as optimality theory, OT. In OT, an input representation, the underlying form, is compared to a range of possible output representations, the candidate forms. These candidates are evaluated against a set of constraints, which are divided into two types: markedness constraints, which prefer less complex or more natural structures, and faithfulness constraints, which require that the output remains as close as possible to the input. The candidate that best satisfies the highest rank constraints is selected as the optimal output. This theory helps explain why certain phonological patterns occur and why others are avoided based on the interaction of constraints.
Now, the next question, the mechanism of Gen in the optimality theory is first able to add, delete, and rearrange the segments of sounds. Second, only able to add a segment of sound. Third, only able to rearrange the segments of sound. Fourth, only able to delete a segment of sound. So the mechanism of Gen in the optimality theory is that it is able to either add, delete, or rearrange the segments of sounds. Network. Yes, it is able to, Gen in the optimality theory is able to either add, delete, or rearrange the segments of sounds. It doesn't matter what falls in the way of Gen. It can do all of it. Add, delete, rearrange, whatever. Look, what I'm gonna do now is that I'm gonna use Airtel. So the mechanism of Gen in the optimality theory that it is able to add, delete, and rearrange the segments of sounds. Now, explain what Gen is in the optimality theory in detail, and how does this statement relate with Gen?
In optimality theory, Gen refers to the generator, which is a component responsible for producing all possible candidate outputs for a given input. This means that Gen generates a wide array of potential realizations of an underlying form, considering various possibilities of how segments, sounds, can be added, deleted, or rearranged. The mechanism you mentioned, adding, deleting, and rearranging segments, reflects how Gen creates different candidates by manipulating the segments in different ways to form potential outputs. These candidates are then evaluated by the constraints to determine the most optimal output. Thus, Gen plays a crucial role in creating the pool of candidate outputs that are subsequently assessed to select the best fit according to the constraints of the language.
Can you give me a simpler explanation of the same thing?
Sure, in optimality theory, Gen is like a machine that comes up with all possible ways to say a word or sound. It mixes and matches different sounds to create various versions. Then, other rules check which version sounds best or fits the language's rules. So, Gen is all about generating different possible ways to pronounce something.
What is eval and gval in the optimality theory? Eval is spelled as EVAL and gval is spelled as GVAL.
In optimality theory, eval and gval are key components. Eval is short for evaluation. It's the process that examines all the possible pronunciations generated by Gen and judges them based on language specific rules. It picks out which ones fit the best with these rules. GVAL stands for Grammar Value Analysis. It refers to how different languages prioritize various rules or constraints differently, affecting the output of eval. Essentially, GVAL helps to understand why different languages might have different acceptable pronunciations or structures based on their unique grammar rules.
Now, can you give me a simpler explanation followed by the explanation that you just gave me?
Sure. In optimality theory, eval is like a judge that looks at all possible ways to say something and picks the best one based on certain rules. GVAL is about how different languages have their own sets of rules, which is why they might pronounce things differently. So eval checks which options fit best with the rules, and GVAL explains why languages have different rules and pronunciations.
Now, the obligatory contour principle in the autosegmental phonology is a rule which prohibits the adjacent identical elements within a specific tier. For example, in languages where tones are used to distinguish words, the OCP would prevent two identical tones from appearing next to each other. Take Mandarin Chinese as an example. Mandarin has a tonal system where the tone of a syllable can change the meaning of the word. Suppose there is a rule in Mandarin that disallows two identical tones in a row within a word. If a word were to have two adjacent identical tones like high tones, the OCP would prohibit this, ensuring that the tones are varied or that the word structure is adjusted to avoid this repetition. This principle is important in autosegmental phonology because it helps to explain why certain sound patterns occur and why others do not. It shows how the phonological rules can influence the structure of words to avoid redundant or conflicting elements, maintaining harmony within the phonological system of a language. That approach is known as optimality theory. So we talk about the optimality theory now. In optimality theory, an input representation, that is the underlying form, is compared to a range of possible output representations. The candidate forms, that is the candidate forms, the possible output representations, Those are the candidate forms. Now, these candidates are evaluated against a set of constraints. So the candidates are evaluated against a set of constraints which are divided into two types: markedness constraints, which prefer less complex or more natural structures, are the markedness constraints, and faithfulness constraints, which require that the output remains as close as possible to the input. The faithfulness constraint requires that the output remains closer to the input. Now, the candidate that best satisfies the highest ranked constraints is selected as the optimal output. Now, this theory helps explain why certain phonological patterns occur and why others are avoided based on the interaction of the constraints. Now, the mechanism of gen in the optimality theory is that it is able to add, delete, and rearrange the segments of sounds. Now, explain what gen is in the optimality theory. So, in the optimality theory, gen refers to the generator, which is a component responsible for producing all the possible candidate outputs for a given input. This means that gen generates a wide array of potential realizations of an underlying form, considering various possibilities of how segments or sounds can be added, deleted, or rearranged. The mechanism you mentioned, adding, deleting, and rearranging segments, reflects how Gen creates different candidates by manipulating the segments in different ways to form potential outputs. These candidates are then evaluated by the constraints to determine the most optimal output. Thus, Gen plays a crucial role in creating the pool of candidate outputs that are subsequently assessed to select the best fit according to the constraints of the language. In simple terms, in optimality theory, Gen is like a machine that comes up with all possible ways to say a word or sound. It mixes and matches different sounds to create various versions. Then other rules check which version sounds best or fits the language's rules. So Gen is all about generating different possible ways to pronounce something. Now about eval and gval. Now, in the optimality theory, eval and gval are key components. Eval is short for evaluation. It's the process that examines all the possible pronunciations generated by Gen and judges them based on language specific rules. It picks out which ones best fit with which ones fit the best with these rules. GVAL stands for grammar value analysis. EVAL stands for evaluation. Now, grammar value analysis. It refers to how different languages prioritize various rules or constraints differently. So GVAL stands for grammar value analysis and refers to how the different languages prioritize different, various rules or constraints differently, affecting the output of GVAL, right? It affects the output of the eval. Now, it refers to how different languages prioritize various rules or constraints differently, affecting the output of eval. So, a gval is actually the one which refers to the prioritizing of the various rules and the constraints differently. Now, essentially, GVAL helps to understand why different languages might have different acceptable pronunciations. So it explains to helps to understand why different languages might have different acceptable pronunciations or structures based on their unique grammar rules. Now, in the optimality theory, eval is like a judge that looks at all the possible ways to say something and picks the best one based on certain rules. GVAL is about how different languages have their own sets of rules, which is why they might pronounce things differently. So eval checks which options fit best with the rules, and GVAL explains why languages have different rules and pronunciations. So eval checks which options fit best with the rules, right? And GVAL explains why languages have different rules and pronunciations. तनु तक तक में सदा जे हो के समझ न लगे रखी गया